I was standing in my backyard, surveying the neat rows of stacked lumber, when a shrill voice cut through the peaceful morning air like a chainsaw through pine. "Excuse me, sir. What exactly do you think you're doing back here?" I turned to see a woman in her late 40s marching across my property line. Her blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked like it hurt. She wore pristine white capris and a pink polo shirt with the Pleasant Valley Estates HOA logo embroidered on the chest. I recognized her immediately as Patricia Jenkins, the HOA president who'd moved into the neighborhood about 6 months ago and had already made herself legendary for all the wrong reasons. "Processing firewood," I said simply, wiping sawdust off my gloves. "Same thing I've been doing for the past 3 years. My name is Grant Holloway, and I'd bought this 5-acre property in rural Washington state specifically because it had enough land for me to run my small, sustainable forestry operation. The house itself was nice, a comfortable 3-bedroom ranch, but the real draw had been the acreage and the mature timber stand that came with it. I'd done my homework before purchasing, making absolutely certain that the property wasn't subject to restrictive covenants that would prevent me from continuing my work. Patricia's face flushed red as she gestured wildly at my organized work area. "This is completely unacceptable. You have created an eyesore and a safety hazard. The covenants clearly state that no commercial operations are permitted on residential properties." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice level. "This isn't a commercial operation. I process timber from my own land for personal use and occasionally sell excess to neighbors. I checked all the regulations before I bought this place." "Well, you clearly didn't check with the HOA." She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures. "This is going in my report. You'll be receiving a formal violation notice within 48 hours. I watched her storm off my property, feeling my jaw clench. This was exactly the kind of nonsense I tried to avoid by buying in what was supposed to be a rural, freedom-respecting community. When I'd purchased the property 3 years ago, there had been an HOA, but it was barely active, maybe collecting $50 a year for maintaining the entrance sign. Then Patricia and her husband had moved in, and she'd somehow gotten herself elected president by showing up to a meeting that only 4 people attended. That evening, I pulled out my property deed, the HOA covenants from when I purchased, and all my permits from the Washington State Department of Natural Resources. I'd done everything by the book. My timber harvest plan had been approved, my processing area met all state regulations, and I maintained proper fire safety protocols. I even had my forester certification, which I'd earned specifically to manage my own woodlot properly. Sure enough, 2 days later, a certified letter arrived. I opened it standing by my mailbox, reading Patricia's formal prose about unsightly timber operations, inappropriate commercial activity, and violation of community standards. The letter demanded I cease all operations immediately and remove all equipment and processed lumber within 30 days or face fines of $100 per day. I called my real estate attorney, Marcus Chen, first thing the next morning. "Grant, good to hear from you," Marcus said. "What's going on?" I explained the situation, reading him the relevant portions of the violation notice. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Do you have your original covenant documents handy? The ones from your closing, right here in front of me. Read me the section about commercial operations." I flipped through the pages. Section 7, Paragraph 3. No property shall be used for commercial manufacturing, retail sales, or industrial operations that create excessive noise, traffic, or environmental hazards. "And what exactly are you doing?" "I harvest timber from my own 5 acres, using selective cutting methods approved by the State Forestry Service. I process it with a small portable sawmill and a log splitter. Most of it I use for my own woodworking projects and heating. Sometimes I sell firewood to neighbors, maybe 2 or 3 cords a year, and occasionally I'll mill boards for someone local. Marcus made a thoughtful sound. That's not commercial manufacturing in any legal sense. You're managing your own natural resources. Do you have your DNR permits? Every single one. My forest stewardship plan was just renewed 6 months ago. State forester came out, inspected everything, said I was doing exemplary work. Send me everything, Marcus said. The HOA letter, your permits, your original covenants, and any correspondence you have with the Forestry Service. I'll draft a response. This sounds like a classic case of HOA overreach. I spent the next hour scanning documents and sending them to Marcus. Then I went outside to continue my work. I wasn't going to let Patricia's power trip interrupt my sustainable forestry practices. The timber stand on my property needed proper management, and I'd be damned if some busybody with too much time on her hands was going to prevent me from being a responsible land steward. The next morning, I was up early cutting a Douglas fir that had been marked for removal by my forestry plan. The tree was mature but starting to show signs of disease, and removing it would allow younger trees more room to grow. I just finished the notch cut when I heard a car door slam. Patricia was back, and this time she'd brought reinforcements. 3 other people climbed out of her SUV. I recognized 2 of them as neighbors from down the road, Bob and Susan Winters, retired folks who spent most of their time traveling. The third was a thin man in an expensive suit who looked deeply uncomfortable in the rural setting. "Mr. Holloway," Patricia called out, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I've brought the HOA board to witness your continued violation of our community standards." I set down my chainsaw and walked over, removing my safety glasses and ear protection. "Morning, Bob, Susan. Didn't know you two were on the board." Bob had the decency to look embarrassed. "Patricia called us last week, said the HOA needed active board members." "We didn't realize there was going to be conflict." Susan elbowed her husband. "We're here to support community standards," she said primly, though she wouldn't quite meet my eyes. The thin man stepped forward, offering his hand. "Gerald Fitzpatrick, HOA attorney. Mrs. Jenkins has retained me to ensure covenant compliance." I didn't shake his hand. "You're wasting your time and her money. I'm not violating any covenants." Gerald pulled out a tablet and started reading from it. "According to our interpretation of the Pleasant Valley Estates covenants, your timber operation constitutes commercial activity and must cease immediately. According to Washington state law and the Department of Natural Resources, I'm engaged in permitted forest management on my own property. I have every legal right to do what I'm doing." Patricia crossed her arms triumphantly. "The covenants supersede your personal desires. You agreed to them when you purchased your property. The covenants don't prohibit what I'm doing. Read them again." Gerald cleared his throat. "Mrs. Jenkins has instructed the board to implement an emergency moratorium on all timber harvesting operations within Pleasant Valley Estates, effective immediately." I felt my temper rising but forced myself to stay calm. "You can't implement a moratorium that contradicts state forestry law. And you certainly can't do it retroactively to operations that were already legal and ongoing." "We'll see what a judge says about that," Patricia snapped. "You've been formally notified. If you continue your operations, we'll seek an immediate injunction and pursue maximum fines." After they left, I called Marcus again. "They did what?" he asked incredulously when I explained about the emergency moratorium. "They're trying to implement a complete ban on timber harvesting." They can't do that. Washington state has specific laws protecting property owners' rights to manage their timber. Let me make some calls. In the meantime, I'd suggest you continue your operations exactly as planned. Document everything. Take photos. Keep records of your compliance with state regulations. That afternoon, I had a scheduled visit from Steve Morrison, my district forester with the Washington Department of Natural Resources. Steve had been working with me since I bought the property, helping me develop sustainable management practices that would keep my timber stand healthy while providing me with usable wood products. Steve arrived in his official DNR truck, a weathered man in his 60s with decades of forestry experience written in the lines of his face. We walked my property together, reviewing the timber I'd marked for harvest. "You're doing everything right, Grant," Steve said, making notes on his clipboard. "This is exactly the kind of responsible private forestry we like to see. Selective cutting, minimal impact, good regeneration. Your stand is healthier now than when you started." "Tell that to my HOA," I muttered, and explained the situation. Steve frowned deeply. "That's concerning. HOAs don't have authority over forestry practices. We have state regulations specifically to prevent local entities from interfering with proper timber management." "You want me to write you a letter?" "That would be incredibly helpful." Steve went back to his truck and returned with an official DNR form. He filled it out right there, certifying that my operation was in full compliance with all state forestry regulations, that my harvest plan was approved and current, and that my practices represented exemplary forest stewardship. He signed it and stamped it with the official DNR seal. "Keep this somewhere safe," Steve said, handing me the document, "and call me if you need me to testify or provide additional documentation." HOAs have been getting increasingly aggressive about trying to control things outside their authority. It's becoming a real problem. "Thanks, Steve. I really appreciate this. Just doing my job." Private forest landowners are crucial to maintaining Washington's timber resources. We can't have HOAs undermining good forestry practices because someone doesn't like the aesthetics. The next week brought another certified letter. This one informed me that the HOA had voted to fine me $500 for continued willful violation of emergency timber moratorium, and that fines would increase to $250 per day if operations didn't cease within 72 hours. I forwarded everything to Marcus, who responded with his own certified letter to the HOA, copied to their attorney. His letter was a masterpiece of legal writing, citing specific Washington state statutes that protected my forestry rights, referencing my DNR certification, and politely, but firmly explaining that the HOA had no legal standing to interfere with permitted timber operations. He concluded by noting that if they pursued further harassment, we would file suit for both injunctive relief and damages. Patricia's response was to show up at my property with the county sheriff. I was splitting firewood when Deputy Sarah Martinez pulled up in her patrol car. Patricia climbed out of her own vehicle right behind her, looking smug. "Afternoon, Deputy," I said, setting down my splitting maul. Sarah looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Holloway, I've received a complaint about illegal logging operations." "There's no illegal logging happening here, and Patricia knows it." I wiped my hands on my jeans. "Come on, I'll show you my permits." I led Sarah into my workshop, where I kept all my documentation in a file cabinet. I showed her my DNR harvest plan, my equipment permits, Steve Morrison's certification letter, and my forest stewardship credentials. Sarah reviewed everything carefully, then nodded. "Everything looks in order to me. You're clearly operating within state regulations. But the HOA has banned this." Patricia interjected. He's violating our covenants. Sarah turned to her patiently. Madam, HOA covenants don't supersede state forestry law. Mr. Holloway has all the proper permits. There's nothing illegal happening here. Then what am I supposed to do? Patricia's voice rose shrilly. He's destroying property values. The neighborhood looks like a lumber camp. I bit back a sharp retort. My operation was neat and organized, nothing like a commercial lumber camp. I kept my processing area tidy, stacked all lumber properly, and maintained strict safety protocols. If anything, my well-managed timber stand increased property values by demonstrating responsible land stewardship. That's a civil matter between you and the HOA, Sarah said. Not a criminal issue. I'd suggest you both work it out with your attorneys. After they left, I called Marcus again to update him. Good, he said. The fact that law enforcement confirmed you're operating legally will help if this goes to court, which I think it will. This Patricia person sounds determined. She's on a crusade. Crusaders make mistakes. Just keep documenting everything. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center, a small building near the entrance to Pleasant Valley Estates. Normally, I wouldn't have bothered attending, but Marcus suggested I show up to put my position on the record. I arrived to find about 20 people already there, including Patricia at a table at the front with Bob, Susan, and 2 other board members I vaguely recognized. Gerald Fitzpatrick sat beside Patricia with his laptop open. The meeting started with standard HOA business, discussion about repaving the entrance road and updating the community sign. Then, Patricia's expression turned stern as she reached the main agenda item. Item 7. Continued covenant violations by Grant Holloway of 4782 Timber Ridge Road. I raised my hand. Point of order. There are no violations. I'm operating in full compliance with state forestry regulations. Patricia ignored me. Mr. Holloway has continued his illegal logging operations despite multiple warnings and formal violation notices. The board needs to decide on escalating consequences. Let him speak, Bob said quietly. That's only fair. Patricia shot him an irritated look but gestured at me. You have 2 minutes. I stood up and addressed the room. I'm not running a logging operation. I'm managing my timber stand according to an approved forestry plan from the Washington Department of Natural Resources. Every tree I cut has been marked and approved by a state forester. My practices are sustainable and follow all environmental regulations. The HOA covenants don't prohibit forest management, and state law specifically protects property owners' rights to manage their timber resources. You're running a business, Patricia insisted. You're selling firewood and lumber. I occasionally sell excess firewood to neighbors and sometimes mill boards for people. That's not commercial operations, it's neighborly resource sharing. I'm not running a retail business. I don't advertise, I don't have business hours, and I don't have commercial traffic. A man in the back raised his hand. I bought firewood from Grant last winter, saved me a fortune on heating costs. His wood is better quality and cheaper than what the commercial suppliers deliver. I think what he's doing is great. A woman beside him nodded. My husband and I appreciate having someone in the neighborhood who actually knows about forest management. Our property backs up to Grant's, and his timber stand is beautiful. Much better than the overgrown mess some properties around here have. Patricia's face reddened. This isn't about convenience or cost savings. It's about maintaining community standards. What standards? I asked. Show me in the covenants where it says property owners can't manage their own timber. Gerald spoke up. The covenants prohibit commercial operations. And I'm not running a commercial operation. I have a letter from the State Forestry Service confirming that. I'm happy to provide copies to everyone here. The meeting devolved into argument after that. Some residents supported Patricia's position, worried about property values and neighborhood appearance. Others supported me, pointing out that responsible forestry was exactly the kind of activity that should be encouraged in a rural community. The board took no formal vote, but Patricia made it clear she intended to pursue the matter aggressively. As people filed out, a short woman with gray hair approached me. "Mr. Holloway, I'm Zelda Garrett. I live over on Pine View Drive. Nice to meet you. I wanted you to know that not everyone agrees with Patricia's crusade. Several of us think she's overstepping badly. I did some research after the last meeting. Did you know she tried to ban vegetable gardens last year, said they were unsightly?" I blinked. Did she succeed? No, enough people pushed back. But she keeps trying to control every little thing. Some of us are getting fed up. Another man joined us, extending his hand. "Frank Torres. I'm on Pine View too. Zelda and I have been talking about organizing to recall Patricia from the board. She's making this neighborhood miserable with her constant violations and complaints. We'd love your support." "Count me in," I said. "But right now I need to focus on defending my right to operate." "Understood. Just know you're not alone in this." The following Monday, I received another certified letter. This one informed me that the HOA was formally filing suit against me in county civil court, seeking an injunction to halt my timber operations and demanding payment of accumulated fines totaling $3,750. Marcus called me after receiving his copy. "They're really doing this. Okay, we'll respond appropriately. I'm going to file a countersuit for harassment and tortious interference with your lawful business activities. We'll also seek attorney's fees and damages." How strong is our case? Very strong. State forestry law is clearly on your side. The covenants don't prohibit what you're doing. Their emergency moratorium was procedurally improper and substantively illegal. I feel good about this grant, but litigation takes time and money. I understand, but I'm not backing down. This is about principle. Good. That's what I wanted to hear. The legal process ground forward slowly over the next several months. Discovery, depositions, endless paperwork. Marcus deposed Patricia, who was combative and condescending, insisting that her interpretation of community standards should override state forestry regulations. Her attorney tried to argue that my timber operations constituted a nuisance, but couldn't provide any evidence of actual harm beyond Patricia's personal aesthetic preferences. We deposed the other board members. Bob and Susan were clearly uncomfortable, admitting under questioning that they'd only joined the board because Patricia had pressured them, and that they didn't really understand the legal issues involved. The other board members were similarly wishy-washy. The key deposition was Steve Morrison from the DNR. He spent 2 hours explaining Washington's forest practices regulations, the importance of private forestry, and the specific ways my operation demonstrated best practices. He brought photographs showing the health of my timber stand, documentation of my selective cutting approach, and expert testimony that my practices were actually improving long-term property values by maintaining a healthy, sustainable forest resource. During this time, I continued my forestry work exactly as before. The HOA sent multiple threatening letters, but Marcus advised me to ignore them and continue documenting my compliance with state regulations. Every tree I cut was photographed, measured, and recorded. Every piece of equipment was maintained according to manufacturer specifications. Every load of firewood I sold to neighbors was documented with receipts. Patricia escalated her campaign. She started posting in the neighborhood Facebook group about my illegal logging operation, calling me a scofflaw, and encouraging other residents to file complaints with the county. Most people ignored her, but a few joined her chorus, posting exaggerated claims about noise and traffic. I made the mistake of responding to one particularly outrageous post, where Patricia claimed I was clear-cut harvesting old-growth forest in violation of environmental protection laws. I posted photos of my actual operation, showing the selective cuts, the healthy young timber, and Steve Morrison's certification letters. "This is not clear-cutting," I wrote. "Every tree is marked and approved by state foresters. The forest is healthier and more diverse than when I started. I'm following all environmental regulations. Please stop spreading false information." Patricia responded within minutes. "You're a liar and a bully trying to intimidate concerned citizens. The HOA will not back down from protecting our community." Zelda Garrett jumped in to defend me, posting her own photos of my timber stand and comparing it favorably to other properties in the neighborhood. Grant's forest is beautiful and well managed. Patricia is on a personal vendetta that has nothing to do with community welfare. The Facebook argument spiraled into a massive neighborhood drama. People took sides, old grievances surfaced, and the whole thing became toxic. I stopped reading it after a few days. In month 5 of the litigation, we finally got our court date. The hearing would be before Judge Rebecca Thornton in Clallam County Superior Court. Marcus felt confident. "Judge Thornton has a reputation for following the law strictly," he told me. "She doesn't have patience for frivolous suits or HOA overreach. If we present our case clearly, I think we'll prevail." The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in April. I wore my best suit, feeling uncomfortable and constrained after months of working in jeans and flannel. Marcus met me on the courthouse steps. "Ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be." The courtroom was small and formal. Patricia sat at the plaintiff's table with Gerald Fitzpatrick, looking confident and stern. Bob and Susan sat in the gallery, looking like they wanted to be anywhere else. Judge Thornton entered, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and sharp eyes. Everyone stood, then sat at her gesture. "This is the matter of Pleasant Valley Estates Homeowners Association versus Grant Holloway," she said, reviewing her notes. "I've read the briefs from both sides. This appears to be a dispute over whether Mr. Holloway's timber operations violate HOA covenants. Mr. Fitzpatrick, you're representing the HOA." Gerald stood. "Yes, Your Honor. The HOA's position is straightforward. Mr. Holloway is operating a commercial logging business from his residential property in clear violation of covenant restrictions. Despite multiple warnings, he's refused to cease operations." "Mr. Chen, you're representing Mr. Holloway." Marcus stood. "Yes, Your Honor. Our position is equally straightforward. Mr. Holloway is engaged in permitted forest management activities protected by Washington state forestry law. The HOA covenants don't prohibit his activities, and the HOA lacks authority to interfere with lawful timber operations." Judge Thornton nodded. "Let's start with the covenant language. Mr. Fitzpatrick, please direct me to the specific provision you believe Mr. Holloway is violating." Gerald referenced Section 7, the same provision about commercial operations I'd read months ago. "And Mr. Chen, your response?" "Your Honor, that provision prohibits commercial manufacturing and industrial operations. Mr. Holloway is not manufacturing anything. He's managing a natural resource on his own property according to state-approved forestry practices. He occasionally sells excess firewood, but that doesn't transform resource management into commercial manufacturing." Does Mr. Holloway have the proper state permits? Yes, Your Honor. We've submitted his entire permit file, including his forest stewardship plan approved by the Department of Natural Resources, certification from his district forester, and documentation of his selective harvest practices. Judge Thornton spent several minutes reviewing the documents on her computer screen. Then she looked up at Gerald. Mr. Fitzpatrick, has the HOA provided any evidence that Mr. Holloway's activities violate state forestry regulations? We're not alleging violation of state regulations, Your Honor. We're alleging violation of HOA covenants. I understand that, but Washington State has clear laws protecting property owners' rights to manage timber resources. Are you familiar with RCW 64.38.020, which specifically limits HOA authority over forestry practices? Gerald looked uncomfortable. Your Honor, we believe the covenant restrictions were in place before that statute was enacted and are therefore grandfathered. When were these covenants created? 1992. And RCW 64.38.020 was enacted in 1985. So no, they're not grandfathered. Mr. Chen, I assume you're familiar with this statute. Marcus nodded. Yes, Your Honor, it's central to our defense. The statute explicitly states that HOAs cannot prohibit reasonable forestry activities conducted in accordance with state regulations. Judge Thornton made notes. Mr. Fitzpatrick, do you have any evidence that Mr. Holloway's activities are unreasonable or harmful? His operations have generated complaints from neighbors about noise, traffic, and decreased property values. You have documented complaints, noise measurements, evidence of actual property value impact. Gerald shuffled papers. We have statements from concerned residents. I'll hear from them. Are they present? 3 people stood up in the gallery, including Patricia. Judge Thornton had them sworn in one at a time. The first was a man named Richard Pemberton who lived a quarter-mile from my property. He testified that he'd heard chainsaw noise on weekends and found it disturbing. Marcus Cross examined him. Mr. Pemberton, are you aware that Washington state law permits chainsaw use during daylight hours on residential property? I suppose, but it's still annoying. Do any of your other neighbors use chainsaws? For yard work, cutting firewood for personal use? Well, yes. Is Mr. Holloway's chainsaw use more frequent or louder than other neighborhood chainsaw use? I don't know. I just know I hear it. How many days per month would you estimate you hear chainsaw noise from Mr. Holloway's property? Richard thought about it. Maybe 2 or 3 days. And how long does it typically last? A few hours, I guess. Does Mr. Holloway operate early in the morning or late at night? No, it's usually mid-morning or afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Pemberton. The second witness was Sandra Yates, an older woman who lived closer to my property. She testified that my lumber piles were unsightly and made the neighborhood look industrial. Marcus asked her, Mrs. Yates, have you ever visited Mr. Holloway's property to see his operation up close? I don't need to. I can see the lumber piles from the road. Are they visible from your house? Well, no. My house is in a different direction. So you only see them when you deliberately drive past Mr. Holloway's property? I see them whenever I leave my house. For approximately how many seconds as you drive past? Sandra looked flustered. I don't know. A few seconds. Are there other properties in Pleasant Valley estates that have firewood stacks, wood piles, or similar outdoor storage? Some people keep firewood, yes. Is Mr. Holloway's lumber storage messier or larger than other residents' firewood storage? It's different. He has too much. How much is too much, in your opinion? Sandra couldn't answer that coherently. Then Patricia took the stand. She was poised and confident, testifying about community standards and property values. "Mrs. Jenkins, how long have you lived in Pleasant Valley Estates?" Marcus asked during cross-examination. 2 years this June." "And how long has Mr. Holloway lived there?" "I believe about 5 years." "So Mr. Holloway's forestry operations were ongoing when you moved in?" "Yes, but I didn't realize the extent of them." "Did you inspect the neighborhood before purchasing your home?" "Of course." "Did you drive past Mr. Holloway's property?" "I suppose so." "But you didn't notice his timber operations. They weren't as extensive then." "Actually, according to Mr. Holloway's records, his operation has remained consistent since he began. He harvests approximately the same volume each year according to his DNR-approved plan. Isn't it more accurate to say you simply didn't pay attention until after you moved in?" Patricia's face flushed. "I paid attention to what mattered." "Mrs. Jenkins, have you received any formal training in forestry, land management, or environmental science?" "No." "Have you consulted with any professional foresters about Mr. Holloway's practices?" "I don't need to." "It's obvious he's running a commercial operation. What's your definition of a commercial operation? Selling products for money." "You ever have yard sales, Mrs. Jenkins?" "Sometimes." "You sell items for money at those sales. That's completely different. How so?" "Yard sales are occasional. He's doing this constantly." Marcus pulled out a chart. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter Exhibit M, which documents Mr. Holloway's firewood sales over the past 3 years. As you can see, he's sold an average of 2.3 cords per year to neighbors, for total annual revenue of approximately $600. This hardly constitutes commercial activity." Judge Thornton reviewed the exhibit. "Mrs. Jenkins, has the HOA ever defined what level of sales constitutes commercial activity?" "It's just common sense," Patricia said. "Common sense isn't a legal standard. Does the HOA have written guidelines? We're developing them." "But you didn't have them when you cited Mr. Holloway for violations." Patricia hesitated. "The board felt his activities were obviously in violation. Based on what legal analysis? We consulted our attorney." Judge Thornton looked at Gerald. "Mr. Fitzpatrick, did you review the relevant state forestry statutes before advising the HOA to pursue this action?" Gerald shifted uncomfortably. "We focused primarily on covenant interpretation, Your Honor." "That's not what I asked." "I was aware of general forestry regulations, but didn't perform comprehensive statutory analysis." Judge Thornton's expression suggested she was not impressed. She excused Patricia and asked Marcus to call his witnesses. First up was Steve Morrison from the DNR. He brought maps, photographs, and technical documentation. He explained forest stewardship principles, demonstrated how my selective cutting improved stand health, and testified that my operation represented exactly the kind of private forestry the state wanted to encourage. "In your professional opinion as a district forester, is Mr. Holloway's operation harmful to the forest or the environment?" Marcus asked. "Absolutely not," Steve said firmly. "His practices are exemplary. He's maintaining species diversity, protecting soil quality, ensuring regeneration, and preventing overstocking. The timber stand is healthier now than before he started managing it. In my 28 years with the DNR, I've seen hundreds of private forestry operations. Mr. Holloway's is in the top 10% for quality and sustainability. Is there any legitimate reason an HOA should prohibit his activities?" "None whatsoever. In fact, prohibiting proper forest management could lead to serious problems. Overgrown stands are fire hazards, disease vectors, and poor wildlife habitat. What Mr. Holloway is doing benefits everyone." Gerald tried to cross-examine but clearly didn't understand forestry well enough to mount an effective challenge. He asked some questions about noise and aesthetics, but Steve calmly explained that all forestry operations involve some noise and visual impact, and that reasonable people accepted this as part of living in a forested area. Marcus then called Frank Torres, the neighbor who'd approached me after the contentious HOA meeting. Frank testified that he'd purchased firewood from me and found my operation to be quiet, professional, and well-managed. "Have you ever felt disturbed or inconvenienced by Mr. Holloway's activities?" Marcus asked. "Never. If anything, I appreciate having someone in the neighborhood who actually knows what they're doing with forest management. A lot of properties around here are overgrown messes." Grant stands out as well-maintained. "Have you noticed any negative impact on your property value?" The opposite. "When I had my house appraised last year, the appraiser specifically commented favorably on the well-managed forest surrounding the property. He said it was a positive factor." Marcus called 2 more neighbors with similar testimony. Then he rested. Judge Thornton took a brief recess, then returned with her decision. "This case represents a troubling example of HOA overreach," she began. "Mr. Holloway is engaged in lawful, permitted forestry activities on his own property. The state of Washington has comprehensive regulations governing timber management, and Mr. Holloway is in full compliance with all of them. His operation has been certified by professional foresters as exemplary. The HOA covenants do not prohibit forest management. They prohibit commercial manufacturing and industrial operations. Managing one's own timber resources, even if some excess production is occasionally sold, does not constitute commercial manufacturing under any reasonable interpretation. Furthermore, Washington state law specifically protects property owners' rights to manage timber resources. RCW 64.38.020 limits HOA authority in this area. The legislature recognized that forestry is important to our state's economy and environment, and that private forest landowners play a crucial role. HOAs cannot override state policy by prohibiting reasonable forestry practices. The evidence shows that Mr. Holloway's operation is reasonable, well-managed, and minimally intrusive. The HOA has failed to demonstrate any actual harm beyond subjective aesthetic preferences of a few residents. I'm ruling in favor of Mr. Holloway on all counts. The HOA's emergency timber moratorium is declared void and unenforceable. Mr. Holloway is entitled to continue his forestry operations. The accumulated fines are dismissed. Mr. Holloway is awarded attorney's fees and costs, to be calculated and submitted within 30 days. Additionally, I'm issuing an injunction prohibiting the HOA from further interference with Mr. Holloway's lawful forestry activities. Any future HOA actions targeting Mr. Holloway's timber operations will be considered contempt of court. Mrs. Jenkins, Mr. Fitzpatrick, I'd strongly encourage you to familiarize yourselves with the limits of HOA authority. This lawsuit was ill-advised and legally baseless. Mr. Holloway should never have been forced to defend his right to manage his own property in accordance with state law. Patricia looked like she'd been slapped. Gerald gathered his papers quickly, clearly wanting to escape. Marcus and I stood as court adjourned. "We won," I said, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. "Completely," Marcus agreed. "And the attorney's fees award means the HOA will be paying for both sides of this litigation. That might make them think twice before pursuing frivolous actions in the future." Outside the courthouse, several neighbors who'd attended the hearing congratulated me. Zelda Garrett was beaming. "That was perfect," she said. Patricia needed to hear that from a judge. Maybe now she'll back off. Frank Torres shook my hand. We're moving forward with the recall petition. After this disaster, I think we'll get the signatures we need easily. Patricia has cost the HOA thousands of dollars in legal fees for nothing. I drove home feeling vindicated but exhausted. The litigation had consumed 8 months of my life and considerable stress. But I'd stood my ground on principle, and the legal system had worked correctly. The next morning, I was back at work in my timber stand, marking trees for the next selective harvest. The forest was quiet except for birdsong and the rustle of wind through the canopy. This was why I'd bought this property, to be able to work in the woods, to practice sustainable forestry, to be a responsible steward of the land. 2 weeks later, Marcus called with news. The HOA has paid the attorney's fees in full, just over $18,000 total. They weren't happy, but they paid promptly. Good. Maybe that'll teach them something. There's more. I got a call from Gerald Fitzpatrick. He's resigned as HOA attorney, said he should have done more thorough legal research before recommending litigation. He sounded genuinely apologetic. At least he learned something from this. A month after the court decision, I received a formal letter from the Pleasant Valley Estates HOA board. It was signed by Bob Winters, who'd apparently become interim president. "Dear Mr. Holloway," it read. On behalf of the HOA board, I want to apologize for the conflict of the past year. The previous board leadership pursued an ill-advised course of action that wasted HOA resources and wrongly targeted your lawful activities. A special election has removed Mrs. Jenkins from the board, and we're committed to a more reasonable approach to governance. We respect your right to manage your timber resources and appreciate your commitment to sustainable forestry. If there are ever legitimate concerns about noise or similar issues, we hope you'll work with us cooperatively. Again, our sincere apologies for the trouble you've experienced. I showed the letter to Marcus. "That's a good sign," he said. "Sounds like sanity has prevailed." What happened to Patricia? According to my sources, she and her husband are selling their house and moving. Apparently the embarrassment of the lawsuit and the recall petition were too much. She's not handling the loss well. I felt a brief moment of sympathy, but it passed quickly. Patricia had chosen to wage war over something that was none of her business. She tried to deprive me of my property rights based on nothing but her personal preferences. The consequences were her own doing. Life gradually returned to normal. I continued my forestry work, processing timber according to my DNR-approved plan. Neighbors occasionally stopped by to purchase firewood or chat about forest management. Some asked advice about managing their own wooded properties, and I was happy to share knowledge. Steve Morrison visited twice more that year for routine monitoring. Both times he commended my practices and updated my forest stewardship certification. "You know, Grant," he said during his fall visit, "your court case has become something of a reference point in our office. We're using it as an example when we talk to other private landowners about HOA issues. It's good to have clear legal precedents supporting property owners' forestry rights. Happy to have helped establish that precedent, though I could have done without the stress." Steve chuckled. "I bet. But you did the right thing fighting it. HOAs have been getting increasingly aggressive about controlling things outside their authority. Your case pushes back against that trend. The new HOA board proved much more reasonable." Bob Winters served out the remainder of the term, then chose not to run again. The residents elected a younger couple who took a minimal interference approach to governance. They focused on maintaining common areas and organizing community events, rather than micromanaging what residents did on their own properties. I even served on a committee to revise the HOA covenants, helping write clearer language that explicitly protected forestry activities while addressing legitimate community concerns about noise and safety. The new language was approved overwhelmingly at a community meeting. By the following spring, the whole conflict felt like ancient history. My timber stand was thriving, with healthy regeneration filling the gaps where I'd harvested mature trees. I'd added some native shrubs to improve wildlife habitat and installed a small bridge over the seasonal creek that ran through my property. One Saturday morning in May, I was working on milling some oak boards when a car pulled up my driveway. I didn't recognize the vehicle, a new Subaru with dealer plates. A young couple got out, looking around with interest. "Hi," the man said, approaching with an extended hand. "I'm Jason Miller, and this is my wife, Emma. We're thinking about buying the property down the road, the one that just went on the market. The real estate agent mentioned you're a forester." I shook his hand. "Grant Holloway. I do small-scale, sustainable forestry, yeah. You folks interested in forest management?" "Very much so," Emma said enthusiastically. "Jason's a wildlife biologist, and I work for a conservation nonprofit. We've been looking for property where we could do habitat restoration and sustainable timber management. When we saw this neighborhood had someone already doing that successfully, it made the area much more attractive. We spent an hour walking my property, discussing forestry practices, habitat management, and the local ecology. They asked thoughtful questions and seemed genuinely knowledgeable. The real estate agent also mentioned something about HOA trouble, Jason asked carefully. "We want to make sure we're not walking into problems." I explained the whole story, from Patricia's initial confrontation through the lawsuit and its resolution. "But the current HOA board is reasonable?" Emma asked. "Very. And we've revised the covenants to explicitly protect forestry activities. You'll have no problems doing what you're planning." They bought the property and moved in that summer. Jason and Emma became good friends, and we often collaborated on habitat projects. Emma even helped me thin some of the younger timber to improve stand diversity. 2 years after the lawsuit, I was invited to speak at a workshop on private forestry sponsored by the Washington Department of Natural Resources. The topic was navigating HOA restrictions while protecting forestry rights. I stood before a room of about 40 private forest landowners and shared my story. Many nodded in recognition, having faced similar challenges from HOAs, local governments, or uninformed neighbors who didn't understand forestry. "The key lessons," I concluded, "are to know your rights, document everything, and don't back down when you're in the right. State forestry law exists to protect responsible timber management. HOAs have legitimate roles in maintaining communities, but they can't override state policy or deprive you of property rights. Get your permits, follow regulations, work with professional foresters, and stand your ground." During the question period, a woman raised her hand. "What about the emotional toll? Fighting with neighbors and going through litigation must have been stressful." "It absolutely was," I admitted. "There were times I questioned whether it was worth the fight. But ultimately, this wasn't just about me. It was about establishing the principle that property owners have the right to manage their land responsibly. If I'd backed down, it would have empowered HOAs to interfere with other people's forestry operations. Sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." Steve Morrison, who was co-facilitating the workshop, added, "And that's why we at DNR are here to support private forest landowners. You're not alone in these fights. We have legal resources, technical expertise, and a strong interest in protecting your ability to manage timber sustainably. Don't hesitate to reach out when you face challenges. After the workshop, several attendees approached me privately to share their own stories. Some had successfully defended their forestry rights. Others were currently battling HOAs or local ordinances. We exchanged contact information and agreed to stay in touch, forming an informal network of private foresters committed to supporting each other. Driving home that evening, I reflected on how much had changed since Patricia had first marched onto my property with her complaints and demands. What had started as a personal conflict had evolved into something larger, a small but meaningful contribution to protecting private property rights and sustainable forestry practices. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. It was Marcus Chen. "Grant, wanted to give you a heads up. I just got a call from a reporter at the Seattle Times. They're doing a story on HOA overreach and found out about your case through public records. She wants to interview you. What did you tell her? That it was up to you, but that you might be willing to talk. Are you?" I thought about it. Part of me wanted to just move on and forget the whole mess. But another part recognized the value in sharing the story publicly, helping other property owners understand their rights. "Yeah, I'll talk to her. Set it up." The article ran 3 weeks later, a well-researched piece about the growing problem of HOAs exceeding their authority and interfering with property owners' legal activities. My case was featured prominently, along with several others involving everything from vegetable gardens to solar panel installations. The reporter had interviewed legal experts who explained the limits of HOA power and provided advice for homeowners facing similar situations. The article generated significant discussion online and in community forums. Some people defended HOAs as necessary for maintaining property values and community standards. Others argued that HOAs had become petty tyrannies that needed stronger legal constraints. I tried to stay out of the debate, having said my piece, but the article did lead to one unexpected development. A state legislator contacted me, saying she was drafting legislation to further clarify the limits of HOA authority over forestry and agricultural activities. Would I be willing to testify before a committee? I agreed, and 6 months later found myself in Olympia at the state capitol, explaining to a legislative committee why clear statutory protection for forestry rights was important. The committee heard from HOA representatives who argued for maintaining local control, from forestry professionals who supported protecting property owners' rights, and from landowners who'd faced conflicts similar to mine. The legislation eventually passed with bipartisan support, strengthening Washington state's protections for private forestry on residential properties. It wasn't just my testimony that made the difference, obviously, but I felt good knowing I'd contributed to a positive change in state law. 3 years after the lawsuit, Pleasant Valley Estates had settled into a comfortable equilibrium. The HOA focused on genuine community needs like road maintenance and organizing annual picnics. Property owners were left alone to manage their land as they saw fit, within reasonable bounds. My forestry operation continued successfully, providing me with firewood, lumber, and a modest supplemental income. One autumn afternoon, I was stacking freshly split oak when a familiar DNR truck pulled up. Steve Morrison climbed out, but he wasn't alone. A younger woman in DNR gear accompanied him. "Grant, this is Rachel Kim, one of our new district foresters," Steve said. "I'm retiring next month and Rachel will be taking over this territory. Thought I'd introduce you too." We shook hands and I gave Rachel a tour of my operation, showing her the timber stand, my processing area, and my record system. "Steve's told me about your work," Rachel said, "and about the HOA lawsuit. I read the court decision as part of my training, It's become a teaching case. So I keep hearing. I just want you to know that DNR will continue to support your operation, just like Steve has. What you're doing here is exactly what we want to see from private landowners. After they left, I stood looking at my forest, at the healthy mix of mature trees, promising young growth, and carefully managed open spaces. This was what I'd envisioned when I bought the property, a sustainable timber stand that would provide resources and beauty for generations. Patricia's attempt to shut me down had failed because she was on the wrong side of both law and common sense. The lawsuit had been stressful, expensive, and time-consuming. But it had also connected me with other people who cared about forestry, property rights, and responsible land stewardship. It had helped establish important legal precedent and even contributed to stronger state legislation. And it had taught me that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when it would be easier to give in. I fired up my chainsaw and got back to work, the familiar weight of the tool comfortable in my hands. There were trees to mark, timber to process, and a forest to maintain. This was my property, my livelihood, and my passion. No HOA president, no matter how determined, could take that away from me. The sun filtered through the canopy above, dappling the forest floor with golden light. Somewhere in the distance, a pileated woodpecker hammered at a snag tree, searching for insects. The forest was alive and healthy, exactly as it should be. I smiled and set to work, sawdust flying as my blade bit into the wood. There was no place I'd rather be, and no fight I regretted having fought. This was my land, my forest, and my right to manage it responsibly. And thanks to a judge who understood the law and a forestry service that supported good stewardship, it would stay that way. Years from now, when the trees I'd planted today grew tall and strong, someone else might walk this land and benefit from the work I'd done. They might never know about Patricia Jenkins or the HOA lawsuit or the months of legal battles. But they'd see a healthy, well-managed forest, and that would be legacy enough. I finished my cut, watching the marked tree fall exactly where I'd planned, dropping neatly into the gap I'd prepared. The younger trees around it would now have room to grow, reaching for the sunlight. The forest would go on, healthy and sustainable, managed with care and respect. That was all I'd ever wanted, and it was everything I'd fought for. The HOA had tried to stop me, but they'd learned an important lesson about the limits of their authority. Sometimes the little guy wins, especially when the law, the facts, and common sense are all on his side. I started limbing the fallen tree, the rhythmic work calming and satisfying. Tomorrow I'd bucket into logs, then split them for firewood or mill them into lumber, depending on the quality of the wood. Every piece would be used, nothing wasted, part of the sustainable cycle I'd committed to maintaining. The afternoon wore on, and the light began to fade. I secured my equipment, swept the work area clean, and headed inside, tired but content. This was the life I'd chosen, and despite all the challenges, I wouldn't trade it for anything. Inside, I poured a cup of coffee and sat down at my computer to update my harvest records. Everything documented, everything transparent, everything by the book. That was how you protected yourself from future challenges, by maintaining meticulous records that proved your compliance with every regulation. My phone buzzed with a text from Jason next door, asking if I had any spare firewood he could purchase. I smiled and texted back that I'd bring over a cord next weekend. This was what community should be: neighbors helping neighbors, sharing resources, respecting each other's property rights. As darkness fell outside, I thought about how far things had come since that morning when Patricia had marched onto my property with her complaints and threats. She'd seen my timber operation as a problem to be eliminated. I'd seen it as responsible land stewardship. The law had agreed with me, and that made all the difference. Tomorrow I'd be back out in the forest, continuing the work I loved. There would be more trees to mark, more timber to process, more habitat to improve. The work never ended, but that was fine. Good forest management was a long-term commitment, measured in decades, not days. I finished my coffee, closed my laptop, and headed to bed. Through the window, I could see the dark shapes of the trees against the night sky, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. My forest, my responsibility, my right to manage as I saw fit within the bounds of law and good practice. Patricia Jenkins had tried to take that away from me, but she'd failed. The HOA had learned its lesson about overreach. The law had been clarified and strengthened. And I was still here, doing exactly what I'd always planned to do. Sometimes justice prevails. Sometimes the system works. Sometimes standing your ground pays off, not just for yourself, but for everyone who faces similar challenges. I fell asleep that night with a sense of satisfaction and peace, knowing I'd fought the good fight and won. My timber stand would continue to thrive, my forestry operation would continue successfully, and I'd never have to worry about HOA interference again. The judge's injunction had seen to that, and the new state legislation had reinforced it. In the end, Patricia had done me a favor, though she'd never see it that way. Her attack had forced me to thoroughly document my compliance, to build relationships with forestry professionals, and to establish legal precedent that protected not just me but every private forest landowner in Washington state who might face similar challenges in the future. That was worth all the stress, all the legal fees, and all the months of conflict. Some battles need to be fought, not just for personal vindication but for the principle involved. This had been one of those battles, and I'd won it decisively. The forest would still be here long after I was gone, hopefully better managed because of the work I'd done and the fight I'd won. That was a legacy worth leaving, and it was the real victory in the end.